It seems South Africans just can't catch a break. Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago announcing yesterday that the repo rate will increase by 50 basis points from today. That means it now stands, the interest rate that is, at 4.75%. Economists have criticized inflation, citing that as in fact prices increase, incomes are staying fixed. So let's make sense of this for you now. Bring in Professor Jannie Rossouw from Wits University's Business School. And Prof, it's great to have these discussions with you. Thanks very much as always for making time. So much being said about the interest rate. I guess, let me put it this way. So much being said about the inflation rate justifying this interest rate increase. But I mean, part of what you point out in a recent piece you've put together is that even inflation differs depending on where you're at. Unpack that for us if you can.
Good morning, Ayanda, and good morning to the viewers, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Yes, indeed, I want to unpack this, but I just want to start with another remark based on a story that you've just covered about the flagpole. Now, to my amazement, Mr. Lesetja planned a flag, and he wanted to have lights on it at night. Now, Eskom can't even guarantee electricity supply, so I really have no idea where this minister lives and where he comes from, planning a flag with lights on it and no electricity from Eskom. So perhaps when you interview him again, Ayanda, you can ask him that question. However, let's turn to inflation, the topic of our interview today. The problem with inflation is that the Reserve Bank doesn't look only at historic inflation, but also at expected future inflation, and the Reserve Bank adjusts interest rates to take care of future inflation expectations. So this interest rate adjustment is to make sure that future inflation does not accelerate. And let's be honest, inflation is bad to everybody in South Africa, but my point is that different people are impacted differently by the rate of inflation. Poor people, for instance, who spend a lot of money on food, do feel inflation much more harshly than the middle class, for instance, who spend less of their money on food. So it is also necessary to be sensitive to the inflation experience of different income groups in South Africa.
How does the Reserve Bank do that in a context where we know that any kind of announcement from the MPC is going to have a blanket effect, if you like, across the board?
The Reserve Bank can only look at the overall inflation rate for South Africa because there's only one monetary policy for all South Africans. So the Reserve Bank looks at the overall inflation rate in its inflation policy decisions and in the way in which it adjusts interest rates. We have to remember that it's very easy for a central bank to fall behind the inflation curve, and we see this problem currently in the United States, where inflation has accelerated and the Federal Reserve fell behind the curve. Inflation is now at a 40-year record high in the United States, and in the United States, inflation expectations have suddenly changed. And the South African Reserve Bank must do everything in its power to contain, and we'll call it an acceleration in inflation expectations in South Africa.
Yeah, and we know that's useful in the context, for instance, of wage negotiations. Typically what unions do is they say that we're expecting inflation to increase by this much, and therefore we want a salary increase of X amount, and that ironically feeds into the runaway effect of inflation kicking in. But the Reserve Bank, interestingly enough, despite what people were expecting yesterday, also being criticized for being too drastic in increasing the repo rate by 50 basis points. Some suggesting that we've still got time considering where we are in the year, and so a 25 basis point increase would have been more suitable. Where do you stand in that debate?
I was also in favor of a 25 basis points increase in the repo rate rather than a 50 basis points increase in the repo rate. However, we have to remember that the Reserve Bank puts particular emphasis on the midpoint of the inflation target range, namely 4.5%, and inflation historically is now at 5.9%. So the Reserve Bank not only wants to contain inflation, but it also wants to push inflation down to 4.5% in order to anchor inflation expectations around 4.5%. And from that perspective, the decision of a 50 basis points increase makes sense. I also have to say that I personally believe that inflation is ungood. Inflation is never a policy instrument. It's an aberration. Inflation, as I've said, is ungood, and therefore I do agree that the Reserve Bank has to contain both inflation and inflation expectations.
Yeah. You know, there are things within our control and things that aren't. For instance, what's taking place in Ukraine, you mentioned the inflation rate in the U.S., many people might argue isn't in our control here in South Africa. But a government, as you've touched on at the beginning of our discussion, deciding to spend potentially 22 million rand on a flag is something in our control. And, you know, I'm bringing that into the conversation because governance issues are never too far from essentially how expensive life gets in this country. I wonder whether you're getting any sense that at least there's some kind of harmony between the monetary policy and what governments can do in order to make life a whole lot more affordable for South Africans.
Well, monetary policy has to be supported by prudent fiscal policy. If we have very expansionary fiscal policy in the midst of inflation, we will have to see much higher interest rates because then fiscal policy is not supporting monetary policy. And unfortunately, we have to admit that our government is not doing very well on the fiscal side. For instance, this government wants to give money to Cuba. Now, Cuba is really not South Africa's 10th province. It's a country far, far away from us. The government argues hardship in Cuba. So this government is really tone deaf. They only have to get out of their black motorcades and look around, and they will see hardship in South Africa, where such money can be spent much more positively for South Africans. But it seems that our politicians, and especially our cabinet ministers, are completely disconnected from what's going on in South Africa. They are rushing around in their black cars, pushing other South Africans off the road, and at the same time claiming we need road safety in South Africa while they are endangering us. So this government is so detached from what's going on in South Africa that it makes the Reserve Bank's job much, much harder in containing inflation.
Not one to mince his words. Professor Jannie Rossouw, thanks very much indeed for your take. Appreciate your time on the AM Report today. Professor Rossouw is with the Wits School of Business, joining us there via our video link.